Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, and at least one fellow graduate of the University of Michigan, I'm very pleased to be here today, and I should like to thank you very much for your invitation to speak to you in the course of this most prestigious series of lectures. With your permission, I will divide my presentation into two parts. First, I will give you a brief sketch of what the Council of Europe is and what the Council of Europe does. In the second part, I will speak about the principle of the universality of human rights, which is clearly a common concern to both the Council of Europe and the Organization of American States. In one sentence, the Council of Europe is an intergovernmental organization created in 1949 to defend and extend democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The Council of Europe, which is completely separate from the European Union and has 47 members compared with the 27 in the European Union, the Council of Europe is a guardian of the European Convention on Human Rights, enforced through the European Court of Human Rights. We are organized around four interrelated and mutually reinforcing pillars. The first pillar is the European legal space. The European legal space is a term used to describe the list of Council of Europe conventions, more than 200 of them. Originally, these conventions were restricted to our member states, but the new generation of Council of Europe conventions, such as our Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings and our Cybercrime Convention, not only combine strong human rights safeguards with innovative approaches in international legal cooperation, but these conventions are also open to non-European countries. These treaties have a real potential to deal with global problems, and we are encouraged by the interest in our work shown by countries from other continents, including the Americas. The second pillar is the Council of Europe monitoring system. Most of our conventions, especially the more recent ones, have a monitoring body which significantly improves the compliance with the agreed rules. An example of such a convention and monitoring body is the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture and its committee, which is composed of lawyers, forensic specialists, medical doctors, psychologists and other experts who are all acting in an individual and independent capacity. The committee, known colloquially as the CPT, Committee for the Prevention of Torture, has the right to enter and inspect any place of detention in any of our member states. Its findings, which remain confidential unless the government agrees to publication, are accompanied by specific recommendations. Over the years, these reports and recommendations have helped to improve the detention conditions in many of the member states of the Council of Europe. The results of our monitoring systems feed directly into our assistance programs, some of them undertaken jointly with the European Union or other international partners, and these assistance programs represent the third pillar of the Council of Europe. The fourth and final pillar is communication and campaigning. Personally, I attach great importance to this dimension of our work, and I have invested a great deal of effort to establish the Council of Europe as a public advocate of European values. Our motivation is not institutional vanity, but the fact that the effectiveness of our work depends on public awareness of our activities. Our mechanisms for the protection of human rights, for example, can only work if people know about their rights and about the possibilities which the Council of Europe has created to protect those rights and to deal with abuses. The four pillars, taken together, constitute what I call the Council of Europe spiral of change. Standard setting produces commonly agreed and legally binding rules. The observance of these standards is monitored, and the results of the monitoring are then fed into assistance programs and back to standard setting. All this is accompanied with reinforced communication about what we are doing and how we are doing it, the indispensable aspect of our work to defend and extend democracy, human rights and the rule of law. Now, the Council of Europe is not a club of perfect democracies. Rather, it is a place of work where governments accept legally binding obligations and voluntarily submit themselves to rigorous monitoring of their compliance with those obligations. Some countries have more difficulties than others, but the fact is that we are achieving progress across Europe. Allow me now to move to the second part of my remarks, which will focus on the principle of the universality of human rights. The question whether human rights are universal is almost as old as the concept of human rights itself. One could argue that, formally speaking, the matter has been resolved. 60 years ago, when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted in the General Assembly of the United Nations, an overwhelming majority of the members at the time voted in favour. Only a few abstained, and not a single delegation voted against. Today, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which are the legally binding treaties based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, have been ratified by around 150 countries in the world. Yet, and in spite of this, the universality of human rights continues to be challenged in theory and in practice. From this assessment, we can draw two conclusions. The first conclusion is that human rights are universal. The second is that their universality is not yet universally accepted. Traditionally, the divide between advocates of the universality of human rights and those who challenge this principle, the divide is seen as an argument between the West and the East. The critics of universality describe human rights as a purely Western concept, born out of specific social, historic, economic, religious, cultural and other circumstances. They argue that developing countries cannot afford human rights because an authoritarian rule is more effective in the process of nation building, economic development and reinforcement of state structures, and that the process is not yet finished. Particularly vocal in this respect are the partisans of the concept of specific cultural values based on the virtues of obedience, order, and respect for authority. This is a so-called Singapore argument, which automatically pops up in practically every debate on the relation between democracy, human rights, and economic development. I will immediately concede that the affluence of Singapore is proof that the economy can flourish, at least for some time, in the absence of democracy and human rights. But that in itself is not a decisive argument. It begs the question of how much greater would be the economic development if the people of Singapore also had more democracy and human rights. We will never know, but we do know that for every Singapore in the world, there are 10 or more countries which can be used to make the opposite case. A more interesting and certainly more convincing argument is the work of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen from India, who has pointed out that no independent and democratic country with a relatively free press has ever suffered from widespread famine. But let me return to Europe. In a global perspective, Europe is clearly seen as being in the pro-universality camp. And it is not surprising. All European countries except Belarus are members of the Council of Europe. And that means that they have all ratified the European Convention on Human Rights, which is at the core of the most comprehensive, far-reaching and binding international mechanism for the protection of human rights. However, it would be wrong to assume that there are no unresolved issues as to the content, the appropriateness, and the applicability of some human rights inside the pro-universality camp and within Europe. As to the differences within the pro-universality camp, we do not have to look very far. I believe that the differences which exist between the United States of America and Japan on one side, and most other democratic countries in the world, about the issue of the death penalty, for example, show that there is no clearly accepted universal interpretation of what the universal principle means, even in relation to such a fundamental issue as the right of a state to execute people.